Thousands of UFO sightings are reported yearly, including contacts with non-human entities. Only a handful of these cases are well known to the public at large, as many appear briefly on one of the various reporting sites only to disappear into obscurity. With this video, my hope is to draw people's attention to some of these rarely told, little known UFO related events. In a rural area of Pasadena, California in the 1930s, a family watched from the window of their farmhouse as strange looking entities emerged from a saucer shaped craft that had landed in an area of the woods behind their home. The creatures proceeded to roam about their property. To the witnesses, it looked as though they were gathering samples. After some time, they re entered their craft and flew off in the direction of the stars. As related by the grandson, the grandfather swore the family to silence, fearing repercussions had such a fantastic story ever gotten out to the community. In the 1950s, a man and a woman in Juiz de Fora in southern Brazil watched as a strange object landed in a field near their home. Against his wife's pleas for him to stay inside the house, the man stepped out into the night and wandered off towards his pasture to investigate. As he got closer to the landing site, he could make out beings, strange-looking creatures, moving around the craft. As he walked in their direction, the beings suddenly noticed him and began moving towards him. That was the last thing he remembered. Inside the house, the wife observed the object as it departed a few minutes later. Fearing for her husband's safety, she ran out into the field where she found him laying on the ground, passed out. She literally dragged him back to the house where he laid unconscious for several hours. It remains unclear what the entities in the field did to the man. In Arvada, Colorado, a woman claimed to have had a number of seemingly anomalous UFO-related experiences. Interesting to note that Arvada is the same spot that Ed and Denise Stoner claimed they were abducted. The woman claimed that when she was a young girl growing up in the 1950s, she began having flashbacks or memories involving large-eyed, big-headed beings. Her description matches what we now call the Greys. At times, family members, including the woman's own mother, had gone into her room only to find her not there. They assumed she had somehow snuck out of the house to hang out with friends, as young people are known to do from time to time. However, the next morning she was always back in her bed and always subjected to the questioning by her parents of her previous night's activities, which she had no memory. Looking back, the woman believed that the beings were entering the home and taking her. Over time, the family believed that she was telling the truth, and the situation was much more frightening than they could understand. In 1975, a UFO landed on the outskirts of Springfield, Illinois. The witness, 10 years old at the time of the event, recalled how his family awoke one night to a loud hissing noise coming from a field near their home. They went outside to see what was causing the noise. In the darkness, they were able to see a saucer-shaped object rise up from a close-by field and take off skyward at a very high rate of speed. The father of the family was so disturbed by what he saw that he dialed up the police, who took his bizarre story to be a prank. Strangely, though, the very next day, a car pulled up the driveway of the home. Inside were three men looking to be in an official capacity. Witness described them as serious-looking. The family originally assumed that the police had sent these men to investigate the earlier call. The father took the three men to the area where the craft appeared to land. They proceeded to collect samples. After they left, the father told the family that they must never talk about what happened under any circumstances. 30 years later, the witness attempted to bring up the incident, and the father became quite upset, even angry. It's quite clear that he had been warned to keep quiet and possibly even threatened. The witness continues to wonder who those men were and what exactly they said to his father to get him so upset. On Saturday, June 6, 1964, Robert Cruces and his cousin were bass fishing at a pond near their ranch in Logan, New Mexico. At around 8:30 p.m., it began to get dark. Cruces was sitting under a tree as his cousin moved closer to the edge of the water about 100 yards away. Suddenly, something on the other side of the pond caught Robert's eye. Quote, "They were standing in a crooked line looking at us. I have no idea how long they had been there. I hollered at him and told him to hurry. I had seen something across the lake," unquote. Unsure of what was going on, the two men quickly gathered up their gear and hightailed it to their truck, which was parked about 150 yards away. Once inside the vehicle, Cruces noticed that even more of them had gathered, about 8 to 10 of them. For the first time, he was able to get a good look at them. Their eyes had a reflective look. They were larger than human eyes, slanted, and their heads were even larger than a human head. Their skin was gray-green, and they had long, skinny arms and short legs. They stood about 4 feet tall, all about the same height, and weighing around 75 pounds each. From their position, they could not see the creature's feet. Oddly, when they would shine the light at them, the entities would at times become either transparent or translucent. The two quickly started their truck and left. The entire event lasted about 5 minutes. Robert had noted previously seeing strange lights over the area, coming together and separating at different locations, but never thought much of it until later that night. One has to wonder what would have happened to Robert and his cousin had they not become aware of their presence and remained there after it got dark. 1971, Yakima, Washington. A woman was out walking her dog when she suddenly and inexplicably found herself 3 blocks away. Not only that, an hour had passed and the dog was nowhere to be found. Unsure of what was going on, the woman made her way home. She feared that she had some kind of neurological disorder and decided to visit the hospital for a checkup. The medical staff chalked it up to a dizzy spell brought on by exhaustion. The dog showed back up the next morning, but this did little to ease the sense of nervousness the woman felt. She knew that what had happened was more than simple exhaustion, and it frightened her. She sought out a psychologist and eventually was hypnotized. The events of that night, the missing hour, would be filled in. She recalled that, at some point during her walk, she observed strange beings who abducted her into their craft and examined her in ways that she described as humiliating. The incident so traumatized her that she would never go out at night alone. She carried that fear with her up until her death. In Las Cruces, New Mexico in 1973, a man observed a very large football-shaped object land about a half a mile from where he was camping. He went to take a look. Standing about 100 yards away, the witness was able to get a very good look at the object while also maintaining a decent hiding spot. The object was large, featureless, gray, and had small, round, dark circles along the edge that the witness guessed were windows. After a few minutes of checking out the craft, an entity emerged from behind the object. The entity stood about the height of a small child, was solid light blue and slightly luminous. Witness described it as a very short person dressed completely in light blue, glow-in-the-dark spandex. Although not frightened at first when the being appeared, Witness suddenly felt terrified. He began to wish they hadn't gotten as close as they did. Eventually a door opened, like a walkway, and the being walked inside and the door closed behind it. No more than a few seconds after the door closed, the object took off at an impossibly slight ascent and shot across the sky. Sometimes sickness seems to follow encounters with UFOs or their occupants. Just such a thing happened to a Louisiana woman between 1981 and 1984. The witness, who lived at Medair at the time, remembered waking up to find that they were no longer in their own bed. Rather, it was a large room with lots of bright lights. Strange creatures were mulling about, performing what looked like medical procedures on her. After observing this for a few moments, the witness again blacked out. Oddly, they were back in their bed the next morning. In short time, she came down with a terrible fever. A family member noticed needle marks on the legs of the witness. To them, the marks resembled those of someone who had gotten flu shots. The fever broke within a few hours. Witness recalled at least 9 other similar instances of waking up with a fever and needle marks, and believed that in each instance they had been abducted. One of these abductions may have been observed by another resident in the area. As reported to a UFO database at the time, someone claimed to have seen a bright object rising up from the area in which the witness lived and had these experiences. After 1984, there were no more episodes. April 27, 1989, a woman, then 7 months pregnant, living with her 3 children and her father in Temecula, California, was preparing dinner for her father. It was near dusk. Inexplicably, she had an urge to turn off the stove and go outside to the front of the house to wait for her father. Her 3 kids joined her. She noted that this was not a common practice and that, to her memory, they had never gone outside to wait for the father before. Standing outside, she looked to the sky and noticed what she thought was an airplane. It dawned on her that this object, whatever it was not moving across the sky, but hovering in place. It It was silver with alternating red, green, and blue or yellow lights. Suddenly, it would jerk away and sort of zigzag in the sky back and forth so quickly that her eyes could not keep up with it. Then it would stop in a spot and hover again. This occurred 3 or 4 times within a time span of about 15 minutes. The ominousness of the object, its odd behavior, became too much for the children, who began to get scared and asked to go back inside. The woman felt a compulsion to stay outside and keep staring up at the object. Quote, "At that point, I sensed some fear, as this was such a unique experience. I wanted to stay and pursue whatever was happening, but then I sensed a sentence in my mind saying, 'If you value the life of your child, go into the house now.' It was very calm, but very stern. I went inside the house," unquote. The very next morning, she was rushed to the hospital, and a week later, she gave birth prematurely. One has to wonder what might have happened had she chosen to remain outside. What might have happened to her unborn child? Further, who, or rather what, placed that warning into her head, and why? In June 1994, a married couple living in a very isolated area in the Colorado mountains awoke at 5 a.m. one Saturday morning to the very loud sound of ice cream truck music. According to the witness, a woman named Carol, who, like the previous story, was 7 months pregnant at the time of the event, the sound resonated through every window, door, crack, and crevice in their home, like a Dolby stereo. Quote, "The only way I can explain it is that it sounded like an ice cream truck was parked directly outside our bedroom window," unquote. It lasted for about 1 minute. The couple could only stare at each other, frozen. After the sound stopped, they dashed out of bed and looked out the window, but nothing was there. They went about checking every room in their home for the source of the music, to no avail. Since they had no neighbors, they deemed it very unlikely that somebody would be pulling a prank, especially at that time of night. They could find no discernible explanation for that strange sound. Interestingly, strange sounds, hymns, children chanting, and music is often associated with those who encounter UFOs and their occupants. Thankfully, those ice cream sounds never returned, but Carol and her husband were left to wonder what exactly they heard that June night and what caused it. Quote, "I do know the music we heard that day was very real and unexplainable," unquote. At around 10 p.m. on September 1st, 1998, a group of hunters and a 12-year-old boy standing on the porch of a cabin in a wooded area near Snowshoe, Pennsylvania, observed at around 10 p.m. a low-flying object passing overhead. One of the witnesses described it as elongated with 6 lights on its underside that formed 2 triangle shapes facing opposite directions. It was completely silent and moved very slowly, taking upwards of 5 minutes to pass over the cabin. To the witness, it was almost as if the object was doing a type of surveillance of the area. In the mid-2000s in Kenton, Ohio, a young boy observed a strange red-orange colored object come down at a high rate of speed into the woods near his home. Dashing inside, the child raced upstairs to an upper floor window, one that looked out over the forest, and scanned the area looking for indications of a crash. There was nothing. A little frightened, the child asked his mother if he could sleep with her. It seems his initial fear was warranted, as later that night the boy awoke to find his blankets being pulled off of him. Looking out the window, which suddenly came open, the boy noticed green lights which illuminated the room. Suddenly, 2 anomalous objects came through the window. At that moment, the mother awoke and the strange event suddenly stopped. Was this an abduction event, a sleep paralysis experience, or something else? The next morning, the boy questioned his mother about what she had seen, and she had no idea about the previous night's events. Las Vegas, Nevada, February 1st, 2004. A woman was startled awake around midnight. She almost immediately noticed a figure outside the double doors to her bedroom. Although she thought herself crazy for thinking so, she instantly recognized the entity as a gray-type alien so prominent in popular culture. Further, she found it odd that she didn't feel frightened. She described the entity as short, with long arms, a big head, and large eyes. It also had an iridescent cloak of some sort. Jumping out of bed, the woman approached the double doors, which were about 12 feet away. She noted that the entity was staring at her intensely as she moved toward it. It lifted its long arm to the other arm and did something. When I took 2 more steps, it disappeared, she recalled. She added, quote, "I know what I saw was real and changed my belief." In the 2 weeks leading up to this event, the woman recalled several odd experiences, including hearing strange voices from her room. She assumed it was her children, and she checked on them only to find them fast asleep. One night the voice said "Mom" right next to her ear. Regardless if the events were related or not, the sighting of an alien in her room and her lack of fright in its presence certainly left her with many more questions than answers. In May of 2010, two young men boating in Lake Michigan, a bit north of Racine, observed an odd sight. It was a beautiful warm day. They were a couple miles offshore. The shoreline was still visible, but just barely. Witness claims that their friend was the first to notice the object to their north, about a quarter-mile away. To them, it looked like a giant white ball floating in the water. They steered towards it. When they were about halfway to the giant ball, it rose out of the water and hovered in the air above the water. To their utter horror, the object, seemingly aware of their presence, suddenly sped right towards them. That was the last thing either of them remembered. Their next memory was waking up in the boat, shivering and cold. "It felt like we had been defrozen even though it was a warm day," said one of the witnesses. They soon realized they couldn't see the shore anymore. A check of the GPS revealed that they were 7 miles offshore, 5 miles further out than before. They steered back towards Racine, keeping an eye out for the giant ball. Had they encountered it again, they intended to go in the other direction, even if it meant going further out onto the lake. The event still haunts the witness years later. In 2011, a husband and wife were awakened by noises in the backyard of their Wilmington, North Carolina home. It was 3 a.m. They peered out the window overlooking the yard and were shocked by what they saw. Two entities were busily moving about. The witness described them as, quote, "small ones with the big heads and bug eyes, like the ones you see on TV," unquote. The husband initially took them for a couple of pranksters, teenagers in costumes. The wife wasn't so sure, as they were very small, more in line with a child of about 7 rather than teenagers. The husband eventually opened the window and yelled at them to leave or he'd call the police. According to the witness, the two beings stopped what they were doing and looked towards the pair. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light. That was the last thing they remembered. They both woke up on the floor at sunrise with the window wide open. They went out into the backyard where they had seen the beings and attempted to find evidence of their presence. They found nothing. This next case was reported by a Mexican ufologist and was reported on the El Muerte Orizaba website. Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. A man, now deceased, spoke with investigators about something horrifying that he witnessed at a neighbor's house. It was in an afternoon, March 2001. The man, standing on the terrace of his home, looked down and saw a strange round vehicle, which he thought at first was a car, pulled up to the neighbor's house next door. 10 little men, his words, wearing tight-fitting red uniforms with black belts, emerged from the vehicle and entered the house in which 6 persons resided. After only a few moments, the strangers left the home, re-entered the round vehicle, and left quickly. The next day he noticed that the family had not come out yet, which was very unlike them. He found this odd, so he wandered over to see if everything was okay. Upon looking inside, he was horrified to see body parts strewn around inside the house. Despite notifying authorities, the situation received virtually no coverage and was, according to the witness, hushed up. Speaking to Albert Rosales about the case, he claimed that not long after the Jalisco case, the operators of the Orizaba website suddenly found it the target of repeated hack attempts. These constant attacks ultimately resulted in the operators of said website walking away from the field. May 10, 2011, Armagh, Northern Ireland. One night between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., the witness awoke from their sleep by the sound of their dog barking at something outside. They lived in the country, quite isolated. At first they assumed the dog was barking at a fox or something, but as they continued to lay in bed, they noticed there was a much more vicious tone in her bark, so they assumed maybe there was an intruder or something. Their bedroom was on the second floor, so they had a good view of their backyard and the fields at the back of the house. There were also a lot of trees around the property. They immediately went to the window and looked out through the blinds and observed the dog, whose fur was white, looking in a northeastern direction. Witness claimed that the parents' room extended out from the back of the house and blocked the view in the area where the dog was looking. Also, even though it was a fairly bright moonlit night, The area beyond the tree line was dark and they could not make out anything. Whatever was getting the dog going, it stayed there, and the dog continued to bark for another 20 or so minutes. Then something strange happened. The dog became ferocious, frantic, like it wanted to attack something or someone, which according to the witness was not keeping with the dog's often timid, easy to scare nature. The other thing that was odd was that the parents were not waking up, which, given how close the dog was to their window, they most certainly would have. Suddenly there was a break in the barking, and the witness, although feeling uneasy, decided to go back to bed. 5 or 10 minutes later, the dog started going berserk again. This time, the witness got up and went to the window. That's when things went from strange to downright terrifying. I will quote the witness, quote, "As I went to the window, I couldn't see her any longer. I lifted the blinds completely up to improve my view. There was a huge, bright explosion of light that lit up the entirety of outside, and strangely, for a light whose source was outside, it lit up the inside of my room completely. The way I describe it to people is as if someone took a photo of you on a disposable camera or something and held the flash bit up at your eyes and took the photo, you'd be blinded by the flash. It was like that, except, strangely, I wasn't blinded by it. It was a blue light, not yellow or white or a mix of colors. It was really bright blue, powerful light," unquote. The witness claims that they instantly became petrified. Quote, "I have never been as afraid in my life. It was fear like I never felt. I turned and ran straight for my bed. I don't remember getting into bed or laying in bed thinking about what just happened or whether or not the dog continued to bark. I remember nothing after turning to run for my bed," unquote. The witness woke up in bed the next morning. A week or two later, they told their parents. Over time, the witness had attempted to explain it away as maybe a fox hunter in the woods shining a spotlight into their room from the forest, or maybe it was nothing more than a powerful, close-by lightning strike, although deep down they knew neither explanation was correct. Quote, "It was an extremely calm night, and there was no weird weather, and I can tell you there was no lamp. This light was so strong, and it lit absolutely everything up. The fact I can't remember even getting into bed creeps me out," unquote. On September 10, 1999, a man living in Jeffersonville in Georgia awoke early to feed his dog prior to heading off for work for 5:30 a.m. As he stepped out of his trailer house, he heard a strange, distinct sound. To him, it sounded like a craft that was having mechanical problems. The strangest thing of all was that, despite the fact that he could actually see the cone-shaped object off in the distance, he could actually hear chattering from whoever was inside the object in his head, which of course made no sense. As crazy as it sounds, he likened it to gaining some type of momentary telepathy. He could hear two strange sounds that he took to be voices, alien voices. In his head, he saw a fleeting image of a humanoid being, and he got the sense that they were in trouble. The object passed over him, and the strange, newly garnered ability passed with it. At work, he discovered that a couple of co-workers who lived around 20 miles away from him had also observed something strange that morning. Interestingly, 2 years later, the witness moved to Dublin, Georgia, where another event happened that not only made local news but also involved a family member. It involved the sighting of a strange object not far from the witness's new home. Much of his family lived within a 1-mile radius of his home where the alleged sighting happened. A cousin of the witness was back in the woods with a girlfriend late one evening getting busy on the hood of a parked car. Suddenly the cousin heard hissing behind him. He looked back and observed what looked like a man standing there, only he didn't look right. His head seemed to be glowing. Assuming he was merely seeing things in the dark, he returned his attention back to his girlfriend. When the cousin looked back a second time, the man was closer to him. Cousin quickly pulled her down from the hood and spun around to engage the voyeur, who suddenly was gone. The girlfriend did not see the man, but she heard him. According to the cousin, the being hissed like a snake or a cat, but looked like a regular man. The original witness had to wonder if his strange sighting that September morning in 1999 had anything to do with his cousin's encounter in the woods 2 years later. On October 22, 2015, a married woman in New York, had been suffering from a series of strange dreams. She had an event, and to her this event was merely another link in the nightmare chain. On this occasion, she would awake to find herself standing in the hallway near her bathroom doorway. She instantly wondered how she ended up there. Her attention was quickly drawn to her left, behind her. She turned her head over her left shoulder toward her dining room. She noticed that there was a gray-type looking creature crouching under her dining room table. It was looking at her. Normally there would be a chair in that spot, and she began to wonder where the fourth chair had gone. That little seemingly strange and innocuous detail, the odd notice of a missing chair, even when faced with the reality of being confronted by a strange creature that shouldn't exist. This is strangely in keeping with Jenny Randall's Oz effect, in which people behave strangely when confronted by the paranormal. Her thoughts of the chair were fleeting, however, quickly replaced by something far more chilling. Quote, "My thoughts were no longer focused on me. I felt what he was feeling instead. As he stared back at me, he was angry. I knew he had been there for a while. He had not planned on or wanted me to see him or know of his presence, and I felt his anger towards this dilemma. I could feel this fury growing," unquote. She described the creature, whom she referred to as male, as short and crouched. It was apparently naked and had an elongated head and skin that she could only describe as like shark skin. It was bluish and looked to be smooth, impervious, but textured as well. The creature's shoulders leaned forward towards her as though he were dramatically leaning forward with his hands on his knees. He had a pot-like belly and wrinkles around his almond eyes. Within a few minutes of this terrifying encounter, the witness found herself back in her bedroom. She and her fiancé awoke at the same time to a huge crashing sound from the dining room. Her fiancé charged into the dining room to check as the witness followed behind him. The corner table had smashed to the ground. 2 legs were broken off, although no pictures or faces on the table broke. It had somehow landed beneath the dining room table. That's when they realized that the dining table had moved a good 3 feet towards the wall with the corner table, under which sat a large window. They checked their alarms and discovered that they had malfunctioned. Strangely, a check of the area determined that the windows and doors were locked and secured. Fiancé looked outside and observed, near the front door of their home, 2 bright orb-like objects that seemingly disappeared into the night. On January 27, 2016, a person living in Kaliri in the eastern region in Uganda was perusing their internet one night at around 10 o'clock when they heard a really loud noise, which they took to be a low-flying helicopter. It was so loud, they assumed it was going to crash. They rushed to the door, turned on the lights in the yard, and went outside. They looked for the helicopter, but instead saw something far more stranger. 2 huge green rings were flying side by side at a very low altitude and in a straight line. It took about 3 seconds for them to pass over, at which point they lost eye contact behind some trees. The entire event, from the sound to the end of the sighting, was about 15 seconds. They knew instantly that these things were not helicopters because the moon was bright and there was no clouds. They saw no rotor blades and they felt no wind. Also, the trees remained undisturbed, something that wasn't likely if the objects were low-flying helicopters. Once they passed over, the witness realized that the yard was eerily dark. For some reason, the lamp in the front yard had gone out. They flipped the switch off and retried it in 10 minutes. The light popped back on, and the witness could not determine a source for its failure. The witness noted that this wasn't the first time they had heard something extremely loud passing over their house. It had happened on at least 4 occasions, but they had always chalked it up to helicopters. A 44-year-old mother who asked her name not be released, we'll just call her Mrs. G, was at her home in Redcliffe, just north of Brisbane, where she lives with her 2 young children, a boy and a girl. On Wednesday, June 10, 1998, she had laid down on her bed. It was around 10:15 p.m. She noticed that the TV was going. She found this odd, as she remembered turning it off before she laid down. She got out of bed to go and investigate. She noticed a soft, flashing light shining down the hallway corridor. She assumed it was just the TV. As she reached the end of the corridor, she turned to look towards her kitchen door and was surprised to see a very tall man standing in the doorway, dressed in some kind of long jacket. The color was tan, peanut paste color, that kind of tan. He had long arms, and she couldn't see his face as the light was coming from behind him. She wasn't scared. She attempted to scream, funny, ha, but nothing came out. Suddenly, Mrs. G got the sense that something was standing beside her, but she couldn't move to see it. Then suddenly, she was inexplicably standing in a different position with her back to the front door. She had no idea how she changed position. She still sensed that there was something beside her. She thought maybe it was the family dog. Then a voice said, "Come on, time to go to bed now." That's when she knew it wasn't the dog. Once again, she came fully awake, sitting on the side of her bed. She had no memory of how she got from the lounge room to the bedroom, or who the voice belonged to. She was quite frightened. She heard the TV again, and then, oddly, it turned itself off. That was it for her. She jumped under the covers and never got out of bed until the sun rose the next morning. The weirdest thing, at least to her, was that she remembered looking at the clock just after getting into bed. It was just after 2:45 p.m. Where had she been for 3 hours? As scary as some of these cases may sound, it does peel back a layer of the UFO field in which some ufologists would like to pretend doesn't exist. A dark side of ufology in which people not only sight UFO, but are taken and sometimes never returned, or when they are returned, they come back in pieces. This is something I hope to explore further in a later video. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed.